All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? We'll just keep an eye on the room to let folks in. But welcome everyone. It's really exciting to be here with you for this webinar today. We haven't done one for a little bit, so we are particularly excited to bring this topic to you today. I'm Jenny Coleman. I'm the director here at Stop It Now, and with me is my training partner that I appreciate so much, Micah, and together we're bringing you today my daughter sexually abused her sister.
Hey everyone, like Jenny said, it's so great to see you all today. My name is Micah. I work on the Helpline, and I also am a training associate here at Stop It Now. We're going to be introducing our lovely guest expert, Jane Epstein, just in a little while. Everyone's going to stay muted, but please use chat to share thoughts and comments as we go along. If possible, we'll definitely respond in the moment, but there's also some time set aside specifically at the end to address any questions that come up. A quick note on audio: if you're having problems or you just want to improve your audio, you can dial in by using the phone number provided. If everyone's familiar with Zoom, there is this little microphone button over on the left-hand side. You can click it and press switch to phone audio and follow the instructions from there. Live transcripts have been enabled, so if you would benefit from some subtitles, click on more, and that's where you'll find it. Finally, there's going to be a brief survey at the end, and after the webinar, you should receive an email with a link to the webinar recording, to the handouts and resources, and to our post survey again. So we just wanted to spend some time to learn more together about sibling sexual abuse, because it is such an often talked about topic for the folks who reach out to our helpline. And as you can see, these are our objectives up on the screen. We're going to get started by jumping right in and hearing from our first letter writer.
Great, thanks, Micah. So I just want to remind folks that when we're doing our Stop It Now webinars, that we are using real letters from the helpline. They are letters that are given to us with permission as we change any identifying information, but as a way to help us share information and to talk openly. So the letter that we're starting with from a parent. My oldest daughter is 12 and my youngest daughter is 11. Yesterday, my 11-year-old came to me crying to tell me she was touched inappropriately by my 12-year-old on Sunday night. She stated when they were watching a movie the other day, she fell asleep and woke up to her sister touching her. She pushed her off and didn't know what else to do. She knows she can tell me anything and shared this with me. What do I do? Who do I notify? How do I help both of them right now? I feel so lost and torn. So we know that these are the voices that we're hearing, parents who are worried, other adults that are worried. And we know that on our own helpline in the last couple of years, 7% of the inquiries that we get are about siblings and concerns with their sexual behaviors. Now, of the contexts that are specifically about concerns with exclusively children's sexual behaviors that could be harmful, a quarter of these are about siblings. And that's just what we know. Not everybody always identifies the relationships. Folks are mostly reaching out after harmful behaviors have occurred. So over 3/4 of sibling-related inquiries are in what we call our red prevention level, our tertiary prevention level, where harm has already occurred. A child has sexually harmed another child, a sibling. And as you can see, another 20% are responding to warning signs. That's our yellow zone, with just a few in our green zone asking for about early safety planning before there's been any warning signs, before there's been any harm. And who's reaching out? Well, parents, of course. We're hearing from them after an immediate discovery, and we're hearing from them years later when their adult child has disclosed that they experienced sibling abuse. And we hear from adults who are looking for healing and support now because they were either abused by a sibling or they're concerned that behaviors that they engaged in as a child with their sibling were abusive, and they want to know next steps and are talking about healing for themselves as well. So this is an incredibly necessary conversation that we're having today. And we're so fortunate then to have Jane with us, who is, we met Jane through our Tangled of our circles of safety training. And we just realized what wealth of knowledge and advocacy she brought to the field. She's a survivor of and advocate for survivors of sibling sexual abuse and is the co-founder of both incestaware.org and 5waves.org, an international advocacy group that offers information, support, and guidance about sibling sexual abuse. She's a moderator of a survivor face group with 5,000 members, and her TEDx talk entitled Giving Voice to Sibling Sexual Abuse has already reached 10,000 people. Jane shares her story publicly to give other survivors the courage to speak up and know they're not alone. She seeks to educate and empower parents on preventing sibling sexual abuse in order to help remove the fear of the unknown and make body safety discussions between parents and children an everyday conversation. And we hope you'll visit the website complicatedcourage.com to learn more about Jane. And we actually did want to play just a little bit of her TEDx talk to further introduce her, and then we'll be setting into our conversation.
Sibling sexual abuse is 3 to 5 times more common than father-daughter incest. That means every time you hear one news story about a father sexually abusing his daughter, there are at least 3 stories of SSA that you will never hear about. SSA typically starts at a much earlier age than other forms of sexual abuse. In fact, the average duration of sibling sexual abuse is 6 years. World War II started and ended in less time. Victims start to feel like there's something wrong with them. Failed attempt after failed attempt to be heard or understood makes them feel like it was their fault. Many choose to suffer in silence rather than risk getting their sibling in trouble or disrupting the family. Others are being threatened or coerced by a sibling and are fearful of speaking up. And that leads to destructive behavior. It can show up as low self-esteem, anger, or self-harm.
Great. Jane, we're so happy to have you with us.
I haven't watched that for a few weeks. It's hard to watch yourself on a big screen.
I had that thought. Well, I was like, I hope she's okay with that.
I'm okay with that.
Great.
First of all, I want to say thank you to Micah and Jenny for having me on this platform. We talked a little bit beforehand, before everybody came into the room, that this is such an important conversation to be had and that we can't lessen the numbers unless we talk about it. I would like to share with the people on the call that I am a survivor of sibling sexual abuse. I am also a parent, but I'm not a parent of a child who has experienced harm or a parent of a child who has caused harm. But for some reason, I'm able to talk about this uncomfortable, icky topic in a comfortable way. So people reach out to me. I've heard from survivors, I've heard from those who have caused harm, and I've heard from parents. So I appreciate all the experts on this phone call, and I welcome learning from you. There may be times that I refer to my notes, but again, thank you for everybody who's here.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. And it's so great to have you here today. Just before we get started chatting and asking you some questions, one of the really important things for us is to always be kind of clear about what we're talking about when it comes to sexual abuse. So first, I'm going to ask you all to just take a quick look at the definition up on your screen and notice how difficult sibling sexual abuse is to identify. There's no clear statutory definition of sibling sexual abuse, though there is a clear definition of child-to-child sexual abuse. Here, there is a general agreement that sibling sexual abuse is behavior that's not age appropriate and not motivated by developmentally appropriate curiosity, and it often involves an exploitation of a power dynamic or force or coercion or some kind of combination therein. And because this is very open-ended, we want to emphasize how important it is for each situation to really be met with a unique eye on what exactly is going on and the motivation, activity, dynamic, and the affect of the children who are involved. Something else to consider is that siblings just see each other at their best and worst, right? They often tease one another. They have some type of rivalry, maybe even if they're close. And they know each other's personal lives. They might know embarrassing facts about each other. And so sexual abuse may be more difficult to spot for these exact same reasons. Like, where does teasing end and abuse begin? On a case-by-case basis, each time siblings play sexual games, it needs that extra scrutiny and it shouldn't just be brushed off. But we also know that it's more likely to be, and we're going to share more on that in just a moment. And I just want to really quickly call attention to the fact that it's more likely to involve physical force or involve intercourse. And it happens at approximately 5 times that of parent-child sexual abuse. So Jane, I just want to ask you, why do you think that this is so hard to define? What are some of the barriers that you see often coming up when we're thinking about what sibling sexual abuse is?
Lack of enough research, lack of enough survivor stories. We need more of both. And as a society, we don't normalize talking about it. It is often brushed off as kids will be curious. So when we don't talk about it, it allows to stay in silence. And then the researchers are left with, they've described it as patchy research. They're researching something that it's been quoted as something that doesn't exist. Yet I think everybody on this call knows that it does exist. And I think it's also really hard for parents and society to wrap their heads around the thinking that their child or a teenager or another child that they know would harm a child sexually, because there's not a clear line. When we talk about an adult who harms a child, there's a clear line. But when we're talking about a child on child or a sibling, it's not always clear. Notice I said it's not always clear. There are certain cases when it is definitely clear. So those are just some of the hurdles to getting to defining it. And as you mentioned in your introduction, every situation is different.
Yeah, definitely. Every situation can be a little bit different just because their relationship is a little bit different. The behaviors may be a little bit different. The way they play together may be a little bit different, and that all needs to be taken into account. And yeah, there's just not enough research on this topic. So how do you describe sibling sexual abuse to other people?
When I talk about sibling sexual abuse, I'm talking about siblings, step siblings, cousins, older adolescents, and perhaps foster children who live in the home. And I describe it as harmful sexual behavior between children. And as you mentioned, it can involve coercion, it can involve force, it can involve convincing. I've also experienced and heard stories where it can start out as curiosity and lead into abuse. And sibling sexual abuse is every bit as harmful and damaging as other forms of childhood sexual abuse. That's how I describe it.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that's really helpful. Do you find when you're talking to people, be it parents or other survivors, that there's a tendency to maybe dismiss it as just a normal part of growing up or experimenting, or even the old adage of like, boys will be boys, or they're just teasing each other?
Absolutely. And the more research I've done and the more stories I've heard, I've realized it's very complicated, it's very complex, and at times it's murky. And so it's almost easier to brush it off as kids will be kids. This happens in every family, they'll outgrow it. Because children are curious, and they are curious about sexual things, and they're curious about sexual things with their siblings too. And sometimes their behavior might need to be rejected in a non-shameful way. But because we don't normalize talking about it, parents and society can make the mistake of brushing it off as curiosity versus abuse. And I think you kind of touched on this, but it's almost better with the statistics going up to approach situations as, okay, maybe something harmful is going on here. Let's talk about it. Let's use this as a learning experience instead of immediately brushing it off as curiosity. With the statistics going up, I just feel, look at it first as abusive, not freaking out, but thinking, okay, let's sit down, let's talk to these children, let's educate them about body safety.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for kind of shedding some light on that. And Yeah, what we were finding when we were looking at some of the research, which was honestly kind of surprising, is that of course it's way more prevalent than parent-child sexual abuse. We know that just child-to-child sexual harmful behaviors is way more common than people think. But sibling sexual abuse is actually the least reported, the least studied, and just in general, the least likely to receive attention. As we were just talking about, it might be downplayed as that typical sibling conflict. When it's brought to the attention of other adults or other professionals, we know there's just that general ick factor of talking about children and sexual behavior at all, especially when we're talking about a parent kind of stumbling in on this, maybe their own children or hearing about it. Children might be less likely to disclose what's going on, and if they do share this with a parent or caregiver, that adult actually might be less likely to take this situation seriously, less likely to get the kids help. And when we're thinking about kids interacting every day, just hearing about your TED Talk that on average it lasts 6 years, without that outside help, harm can be really prolonged and intense. So Jane, why do you think that this is so rarely disclosed and reported? A lot of the parents who we talk to seem way more likely to consider asking for help or reporting it when it involves children who may not be related. Why do you think that is?
I might be repeating myself a lot here when I say that we aren't studying it, we aren't talking about it enough. So I'm actually going to break this down into two categories as to why a child may not report, and then I'm going to break it down to why a parent not report. Children who don't report, they have some similarities with other forms of sexual abuse. The fear of being believed, fear of getting someone in trouble, fear of getting their sibling kicked out. They might have shame surrounding the way their body interacted, or they might hope that it stops on its own. Something unique to sibling sexual abuse is, I'm going to read from my notes here. When we talk about siblings, it could be that neither child recognizes what's going on as abusive, the child who was harmed and the child who caused harm. They may understand to an extent that it's wrong, but they don't have the cognitive ability or vocabulary to describe it or understand the full consequences or the severity of the activity. When they start to get older and more sexually mature, then they understand. Again, no one's talking about it. You're not being educated about it. I know from my personal experience, I didn't understand that I was being harmed, and my sibling didn't know that he was harming me. So that's from a child who's being harmed perspective. A parent's perspective, again, no one's talking about it. They feel very isolated, they feel very alone, and they might be tempted to handle it home on their own. But if we slide it under the rug, then no one can get the help that they need. And shame may make it easier, because a parent experiences shame and guilt. How am I a bad parent? It might make it seem easier to slide it under the rug and ignore it and think kids will outgrow it. But in reality, children all need the help. And in fact, I'm going to quote Brad Watts, author of Sibling Sexual Abuse, has stated that juveniles who cause harm have some of the lowest rates of reoffending, with an average of 5% with the proper treatment and parental support. So it's really important that we don't brush it under the rug and ask for help. And you also asked the question about why they would report another child. I think if there's any parent on this call, it's going to be much easier for me to point the finger at another child as opposed to seeing my children in less than perfect light. And as a society, it's hard to ask for help in situations. And when you're asking for help in a situation where there's so many unknowns and there could be judgment, how do you do that? It's hard.
Yeah, Jane, there's a comment in the chat from someone who said that their experience in dealing with this type of abuse has been playing house. And, I'm toying with that in my head because I want to differentiate between the fact that children can engage in sexual behaviors together. And we're really trying to talk about when one sibling has more of a power of control. And even if that siblings doesn't have the knowledge that this is abusive or harmful, there's still a difference in the relationship about what's happening than a real mutual play. Am I thinking about that correctly, or am I kind of going off on a tangent to fit my framework?
if I'm understanding you, Jenny, are you saying we could have, I guess whenever I come across this type of situation as a parent and as a survivor and as hearing these stories, I've heard thousands of stories. If this is where sibling sexual abuse gets really tricky, is it curiosity or is it harmful? I would look at this experience as, okay, let's sit down, let's talk to our children and say, okay, you have some questions, you've got some curiosity. It's a great way to create an open door policy, which you're going to need when they're teenagers anyways.
Mhm.
So why not create that now and talk to them about body safety and say, you can end it with, okay, and by the way, we don't touch our siblings, we don't let cousins touch our private parts and go into adolescence, and don't have a one and done conversation. Keep talking to them. Did I answer your question properly? Is that where you were going?
Yeah, mostly. Again, it just to me points to, kind of the vagueness or confusion about this. And in fact, it even makes me think, Micah, in that slide right before, and somebody commented on in the chat as well, that not that it's not transitory, that was also one point, but we said that it wasn't curiosity driven. And I would disagree with what we already said, that in some cases, it may be initiated from that kind of normalized curiosity between children, but at some point it changes. The dynamics are changed, and it's no longer a mutual exploration or, and it just again becomes something that now is crossing lines, has maybe more manipulation, maybe more secrecy. Maybe it's as the children age or they learn more about privacy, about their bodies, about safety rules, and realize, oh, this is not what I should be doing. So I know each child's story can be so different, but again, it just strikes me why it is so difficult for folks to kind of pin this down and make, whether it's a diagnosis or whether it's, yes, this is harmful and abusive, because we don't want to label kids. We understand normative curiosity, and yet we absolutely need to also understand the boundaries that get crossed, and that we need to respond to that very seriously, with a lot of safety planning and healing responses as well.
Jenny, may I respond to that real quickly?
Please.
I was sexually abused by a sibling who was 6 years older than me, which is a warning sign in itself.
Right.
My sibling and I, we speak, and I asked him why, thinking he would tell me he'd been sexually abused prior. His answer to me was, I was curious, and you were there. You were available to me. And he began just it started out as curiosity, and then it went on to 6 years of abuse. And so it can start out as curiosity. And I think that's why it's so important that we talk to our children.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Appreciate that.
I think that's a really good point too. And yeah, just to echo what Jenny said, like, curiosity is a big motivator for kids when they're learning, and they don't always have all that knowledge about what's appropriate about when, where, why, how. And if there is a younger person that they're close to in their home, sometimes that can be where harm starts without them realizing it. And I think that's why, as we'll talk about this a little bit later, we do hear from a lot of young adults and adults who are just now realizing that either they were sexually abused by their sibling or they abused their sibling when they were younger. And now it's all making sense. Yeah, so we talked a little bit about the impacts and the barriers. And now we just want to kind of move on to research, because it does show that, of course, just like any child who experienced sexual abuse, there's this disruption of developmental tasks and stages in sibling sexual abuse. They may have trouble with relationships and mental health, and they may engage in other risk-taking behaviors like self-harm, delinquent behaviors, criminal behaviors. But we see that it's at a severity that seems to be the greatest in sibling sexual abuse. And this is most likely attributed to the fact that they're least likely to receive that professional intervention. And of course, that makes it more likely for these consequences to keep going into young adulthood and maybe into adulthood. For the family, this can feel like, a loss of control. They need to change their routines, how they're watching their kids. There's this worry about maybe reporting and outside interventions, and this unique sense of shame or anger as a consequence. And honestly, this can be kind of that catch-22, where the more shame and denial they may feel, the less likely it may be that they actually seek help for their children. So Jane, we've kind of shared a little bit on this already, but how else is the impact of sibling sexual abuse different to those involved?
Yeah, I'm going to state that sibling sexual abuse is a whole family trauma. It impacts the child who is harmed. It impacts the child who harmed. It impacts other siblings in the home. It impacts the parents, and it can even impact extended family. For the child who is harmed, I stated this in my TEDx, that it usually starts at a year earlier age and goes on for a longer duration. And we need to talk about the child who is harmed as well. Until there's more awareness about SSA, any mention of what they have done carries the risk of them being labeled for life. And we need to be careful not to label them, because with the proper therapy and treatment, there's a possibility that they are not a harm to society. And the long-term effects on the child who caused harm, I have teenagers, I have adults reach out to me, and they carry a lot of guilt and shame as well. And many of them are suicidal. So there is harm to them as well. The parents, as a parent, the harm to a parent, if you discover this in your home and you love both children, how do you reconcile that? It's not like it's the coach down the street or the preacher where you can create distance and you can hate them. These are your children and you love them. Parents are not equipped to handle this on their own. And in fact, it can be really hard on a marriage, particularly when there's step siblings.
Yeah.
And then there's the other sibling in the home that wasn't impacted. The resources all go to the rest of the family, and then everybody. It's like I said, it's a whole family trauma. It's been described by some experts as like a grenade going off in your family.
I think that's really important to, I think that's just important to note, because oftentimes people obviously think of the person who was sexually abused as needing support, and the person who maybe they also understand that the person who engaged in the abusive behavior also needs support. But yes, it's everyone who is involved who actually needs that support to kind of relearn how to interact, how to process your feelings, how to get back to a place where we acknowledge what's happening and move forward and heal. So thank you.
Yeah, and I was just going to add too, Jane, you're speaking our language when we talk a lot about how children's sexual behaviors, even when they're harmful and abusive, are not the same as adults' sexual behaviors, and that we cannot treat children who have sexually harmed the same as we treat adults. And while I don't have the statistics at my fingertips, and we know that youth who have sexually harmed most often do not go on to be a person as an adult who sexually harms children. So it is so important that right from the beginning, we're responding to everyone, and we'll talk more about the kind of response, but that we are offering support and understanding and recognizing that everyone in the family needs and deserves opportunities for healing, for education, for support, and certainly for safety. And I want to address just real quick before we move on, just because there's a really great question in the chat, and Lexi, fabulous question. I'm going to hold that though just for a few more slides, and so I just will bring that up. I just appreciated what you said and wanted to make sure there was witness. So,
Jenny, I'm going to add to your last comment. I believe Brad Watts, author of Sibling Sexual Abuse, has stated that with the proper treatment, 95 to 98% of children will not go on to harm later in life. I believe that's the statistic. And,
yeah, I thought it was pretty high.
Yeah, it's very high. And I've noticed that the experts have started using terms harmful sexual behavior, child who caused harm, and child who was harmed, as opposed to predator, victim, because apparently those are more adult terms and they're more right and wrong. And that's why I've adopted those terms as well, because you are still talking about children.
Yeah, our model here at Stop It Now is really to use person-first language for children and adults, but particularly with children, I know that I get a little like wacky when I see someone referring to a 9-year-old as a pedophile, for example, that's going to be a barrier. It's not going to help us treat this child, help the family. So yeah, thank you for calling that out.
It's also not going to help society be willing to talk about it. If we
Right.
run around saying your child caused harmful sexual behavior, they're a pedophile, then parents really aren't going to come forward. So it does everybody a disservice.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, there's just some great chat going on. I'm going to go ahead and throw this question out because it kind of fits in here, but a good question on what role does a child's access to pornography play? And yeah, I see your face, in sibling sexual abuse.
Huge. I will not talk pornography because I feel like they're a very big giant and I don't want to rattle their cage. But the stories that I'm hearing, and particularly the last few years, the exposure to pornography, access to pornography, and then the last 2 years we spent, in homes with our siblings, and there's all kinds of research out there. And yeah, definitely we need to be talking to our children about not if they're exposed, but when they're exposed.
Yeah, I don't think that this is unique just to sibling relationships. We know that the accessibility and viewing of pornography is greatly influencing youth's perception of what relationships, intimacy, sex look like. The courting process, is there one? Our new What's Okay website for youth. That's one of the things we're hearing a lot about, is the impact of pornography on their behaviors and the impact that it's having in feeling out of control with wanting to see these images frequently. So whole other webinar, absolutely. All right, I better move us on. I knew this would happen, that we would just want to chat you up quite a bit. So let's move on to talking about loving them both. And we've already, talked about that just a little bit, that the parents, one of the impact, and we're going to come back to this a lot in this webinar, is about the parent's sense of responsibility, and just it's like having to have two different parents inside of you, parenting a child who's been harmed, who's hurt, who may be scared or confused, and parenting a child who's harmed and who's scared and worried, and everything in between that, and the feelings that we may have about children, because we're just human. And when we find out that a child of ours has been hurt, or a child of ours has hurt, there's just some natural places we may go to. And I know that for parents too, it's not just, one of my kids hit another kid. When something like this happens, it could involve really a whole new family routine. It may require the environment to change. It may require new guidelines, new rules, different communication. So there's a lot to think about. And so I was, wanted to ask you if you could just speak particularly to the professionals right now in the audience about the impact of abuse on the family systems, and what might be different when dealing with particularly two children under the same roof, or who are regularly together in a close family. I used to maybe cousins or step siblings that have come together quite a bit. Is there anything that we would want to add to our knowledge of the difficulty in parenting a child who has been abused or who has sexually harmed another?
Sorry, I was muted. That's a big question, Jane.
It
It's
is
a long question. Again, it is a whole family trauma, and the whole family will need support, and they're going to need support beyond what you are giving them right now. This is going to go on for years. Sorry, that was a long question. I'm trying to hold on to it. Maybe it's in the chat, but
well, just as a professional, one of the questions that we had was about how to help families talk about this.
Okay.
And I was going to wait for this question, but maybe this will, about how to speak out about it for folks who are marginalized, disenfranchised, folks in oppressive communities. And I guess that's not really the question. For me, what I'm thinking is, if I was a professional who knew that in this family there has been sexually harmful behaviors between children, what would we want that professional to know about how to approach this abuse, if you want, situation, as opposed to, this is something that happened with a child at school, on the school bus, or outside of the family?
Okay, that narrows it down.
Okay.
Yeah, again, it's going to require professional intervention. And I think that the situation is dependent on what has occurred. The risk has to match the situation. We need to make sure that the child who harmed, do they need help? Do they need counseling? Do they need to be removed from the home? And if a professional comes in and the child needs to be removed from the home, I've had parents ask, hey, can you express to us that the child might need to be removed from the home for the health and safety of everyone else involved for now, temporarily? Because when parents are processing this is a huge trauma for parents as well. And they feel like CPS is eyeballing them and blaming them for everything that happened. And they are going through trauma and possibly denial as well. So that's one thing. Parents have so much to say on this situation. Another parent has said that, they get thrown into this legal system and there's no one there to support the parent. But yet the parent is there 24/7 supporting both children. So the parent needs support as well. And we need more guidelines. We need more research, because right now it's like the wild, wild west out there. It depends on who you report to. It depends on if the police officer has ever heard of this. It depends on if the social worker has ever heard of this. I will say there's more and more social workers getting educated about this, so that's really helpful. But I've run into social workers who have said, well, kids are just curious. That happens in every family. So I hope I'm answering your question. But as far as helping to marginalize, I want to take this opportunity to say that, yes, I feel that they are at greater risk. But I have also run into many, many families where I feel like no family is immune. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We know that. And we know that there are children that are in more vulnerable environments. We'll talk about that in a moment and maybe come back to that question, because it's so important. Actually, I want to take just a step back for a second, because again, we're still trying to really wrap our heads around, how do we know it's sibling sexual abuse? How can we really pin it down? And so our list, here's some lists for folks of some very clear harmful sexual behaviors. And it really helps us begin to recognize that there's a lot of factors and dynamics, and that while children may exhibit play that's sexualized, as we've discussed, play that's normative, that's based on curiosity, that when a child's play is sexualized, is forced upon another child, then this too becomes harmful sexual behavior. Now, and as I say that, I want to be clear that force does not have to be a part of sexual harm. And when we think force, we often may think kind of physical force. And I know in general, when we talk about sexual abuse, adults or children engaged, that we tend to have a lot of violent imagery, but that's not always the case at all. So just wanted to call that out. But I was wondering, Jane, if you could talk to us about how coercion and manipulation might look within that sibling relationship.
Sure. I'm going to share what I've heard from parents, survivors, as well as my experience. It can start out as, if we can do this, I'll let you play on my phone, iPad, Nintendo, electronic device, you name it. You pick something to do and I pick something to do, and we both have to do it. I'll time you. Let's see how quickly you can get both undressed or do a sexual act. This is pretty current. I saw the coolest thing online. Let's try it. If you don't do this with me, I'm going to tell mom, dad that you were sneaking time on your phone. Children have also been bribed with money and drugs as of late.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think, Micah, what you said earlier, that children know the best and the worst of their siblings. They know what's going to get their goat, what's going to motivate them, what's important to them, what's shameful to them. And so they've got a lot in their bag of tricks, really. I would imagine more so than children who are not related. And we often refer to this chart to help us think about specific behaviors and assess their risk. And looking at the variables, we really can better understand what the behavior may be about. And when we determine that there are unhealthy factors like manipulation and control, we can better identify warning signs in a child's behavior. And so, all of these can come up, or just one or none of them. And we always want to ask questions, though, if we have any concerns about the behavior. But I'm wondering, Jane, are there specific warning signs that you think we can pay attention to kind of alert us that, oh, there's something that may not be safe here? What can we tell parents that they should be watching out for?
I'm going to state that, first of all, it's been stated that 40% of children who are being sexually abused don't show signs. So there's that. And then there's the signs that other children exhibit that we've talked about, I'm sure, in other webinars for sexual abuse that can carry over to siblings as well. Is one sibling resentful or jealous? We talked about more powerful, but what that might look like as in babysitting. Your sibling's in charge. Do everything your sibling tells you to do. That's one warning sign. This is a big one, and it's actually very personal to me. Parents have instincts. Let's listen to those instincts. I have heard a story from a parent. They walked in on a situation in a room, no reason to believe that anything is going on, but they sensed it. And they listened to those instincts, and they asked their children, and they discovered sexual abuse was going on in their home. It's also very personal to me because I was being sexually abused by my brother, and my father was walking down the hallway, and he said, "What's all that noise? What's going on in there?" And we scattered. He opened the door, looked in, and closed the door. So listen to your instincts. Even if you don't want to go there, even if there's nothing that you can see happening, even if you walk in on two children and something is happening, no one's screaming or crying, just don't assume. So listen to those instincts that you're given to. That's a big one for me. Is one child overly eager to babysit a younger child? Does a child tell you they want to sleep with you? I've actually heard this from survivors, because a lot of times sibling sexual abuse can happen while children are sleeping. And if a child doesn't have the vocabulary or doesn't want to get their sibling in trouble, they may say they want to sleep with you. They're not being a pain. They might just be using the only words that they know how. They want to sleep with you, or if they don't want to be left alone with their sibling. Again, I don't think children are trying to be a pain. They might be trying to communicate something to you. Other survivors have reported, has their personality changed, acting out, angry? Children, again, don't change overnight for no reason. A lot of survivors that I've heard from and within my survivor group, a missed warning sign was anger, rage. And I know I personally experienced that. And now reflecting back, I can see, okay, that was shame. That was lack of control taken from me. So listen to those signs. Has one child experienced sexual abuse or pornography, or exposure to pornography? That's something to look for, keep an eye on that. And I don't know if you want me to touch this question right now or not, if it's more difficult to know when it's happening for parents. Would you like me to address that question now or later?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I'm going to say that as parents, I think it is harder to identify that it's going on because, one, we aren't talking about it. I can't tell you how many parents have reached out and said, we didn't know this was a thing. We didn't know. So it is hard for them to see because they're not thinking about it. They're not even thinking this is happening in their home. And many survivors have shared with their adults, when they are adults, they share with their parents that this happened. And sometimes the parents will say, oh, yeah, now it makes sense. One parent reported, I don't know how parents talk to their kids about the possibility of sibling sexual trauma without instilling a feeling of fear or mistrust. So this is something we the professionals, we need to work on. This is why parents, schools, therapists, and religious institutions need to partner, as the education may be best coming initially from someone other than that parent. So we still have a lot of work to do. Another parent reported, I don't think it's ever easy to know when child sexual abuse is happening, no matter who is doing it. But she thinks with more awareness of the prevalence, parents, teachers, and everyone should be looking at sexual abuse as a likely explanation when kids do exhibit troubling behavior, as one of the first things to talk about or look into. So there's still some work to do.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question in the chat that's related here to this section. When curiosity persists for both children and neither one is forcing the other, is it still abuse? So when they are, again, mutually engaging in sexual behaviors, is it still abuse if it reaches the level of intercourse? Are they abusing each other? What would you respond? Yeah, it's a good question.
I think it's a great question, but I also think that if it's not age appropriate, that it is harmful. They may not recognize it as harmful right now, but they're gonna look when they sexually mature. I don't know what age group we're talking about here.
Right.
But I think that needs to be approached as harmful.
Yeah, and that's where I would ask folks to think about then this chart on your screen right now, that can help us understand then what boundaries may be being crossed. Is it age? Is it developmental differences? Is it verbal differences? Is it size differences? So even though two kids may be saying yes, we really know that, first of all, children cannot consent to sexual behaviors. We know that they still engage in exploratory sexual behaviors. But if in the other variables, we are seeing concerns with the dynamic, with the motivation, with the actual activity itself, such a mature adult activity as intercourse, that it could be the same age, both kids are saying yes, this is unhealthy, right? So we don't even necessarily need to say harmful or abusive, but what we know is this is not healthy, and that we need to address it, the environment, have conversations, and whatever else may be needed based on the uniqueness of that situation.
Yeah, again, back to the uniqueness of the situation. I don't know what age we're talking,
Right.
and I don't know when it started, because your body does respond. Your body responds. Your body doesn't
Exactly.
understand that this is my sibling doing this to me. Your body still responds, and so you might think that it's okay, but I would think that that's harmful.
Yep, it is. And I just want to let other folks know, great comments again in the chat. I'm not going to touch on all of them, but I hope folks are taking a moment to also read a lot of the great wisdoms that we have some of our audience participants sharing.
Yeah, great. We're going to talk about responding to a discovery of abusive behaviors in just a few moments, but we also wanted to roll it back and adjust what we can do to build protective factors in families to prevent sibling sexual abuse. And that includes environmental and situational factors. It's really important to touch upon just some of the vulnerabilities that can increase risk within the home for sibling sexual abuse. Of course, when we're thinking about vulnerabilities, we want to think about kids who are already at an increased risk to experience abuse, like, for instance, LGBTQ kids, those who don't have strong social or emotional supports, and those with disabilities. And there's a lot of other kids out there who may be vulnerable. But studies have also shown that there are some common factors for the backgrounds of kids who have experienced sibling sexual abuse, like domestic violence, other types of abuse and trauma, be it poor sexual boundaries in the home, or even a lack of supervision. There's also just the general consideration that kids who are often together as they're learning and growing may engage in that normal explorative play together. And that's something we've been touching upon a lot. Kids, there is that healthy curiosity, but without intervention, it absolutely can become harmful. And that's why we really need to pay attention. So Jane, I was wondering, is there anything that you wanted to say specifically about vulnerable environments or situations, and what specifically you've noticed raises the risk for sibling sexual abuse? Anything maybe even anecdotally, or that you've seen through the research or through people that you've talked to who are affected by this?
Yes, and you have touched on a lot of the factors that can play into this. And this is actually really important to me. So I am going to read from my notes here a little bit, because 40% of all child sexual abuse is estimated to be perpetrated by juveniles. And I think that the number is probably higher than 40%. This is right when they hit the age of puberty. And when they hit the age of puberty, a huge jump of sexual abuse between siblings and children goes up. And this is where we have the most impact to stop the behavior, because they have different motivations, because juveniles harm in a different way than adults. They are not going into public seeking victims and preying upon children. Instead, they may not be understanding their sexuality or not having resources or people to talk to about it, so a younger sibling or cousin is available. Children feel safer. They feel like it's a safer place to explore their sexuality. I believe this age group, say 10 to 14, I believe they deserve to be educated as well. And I say this because I've had so many people who have reached out, have caused harm, and they say, I didn't know. I wish I would have known. And I think that this is a huge opportunity for us to educate them and let them know. Again, I would need professional resources on how we word this with them, that they are at risk of harming a younger child and living with regret. They deserve to be educated too. We don't want our children on any side of this. We don't want them to be the child who harms or the child who is harmed. So again, with no family is immune, especially with pornography being so available. And again, you did touch on some of the high risk environments that I was going to mention.
Yeah, and I think it's a really important note to kind of touch on just the fact that when kids don't really know what's healthy and appropriate, they're not going to have that good understanding of where the line is, especially as they're moving into puberty and sexual feelings start coming up. If they've never been talked about these things, that can be really confusing. They're trying out new things. And just thinking about pornography too, I know we touched a little bit upon this, but if that's their first introduction to the sexual world and they're not equipped to handle and understand and manage, this might be something that they try out on other people, and that can lead to some really harmful things.
Absolutely.
Mike, it makes me think too about a case that I use a lot in training, where we tell kids, you can tell me whenever anybody touches you, here's the places on your body that are not allowed to be touched, and we can set these boundaries, and kids are kids. And they have loyalties. And so I always think about a story of a mom who said, but I told him of a 9-year-old who had been sexually harmed by an older cousin. I told him to tell me, I've always been open. We've talked about this. And her 9-year-old said, but that's my favorite cousin. I'm gonna do what he wants me to do. And so we need to be as explicit as we can in the, even with the people that we love the most, like our brothers, our sisters, our cousins, et cetera, and really detail as much as age appropriate as we can. These are not okay behaviors between anyone. And this includes people that you really love a lot, and that you share a same house with. I think the more that we can think of examples to give to children, because children are great at finding the exceptions to rules as well. And so that means not just in home, our physical home, but that means when we're visiting grandma and grandpa. That means when you're away at camp together, or when you're on the school bus, whatever the environment is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to, just because we can't rely on kids themselves to always know when something's wrong, to what we were saying before, to acknowledge if we're having an intuition, or to be curious when a child is saying something that just feels weird or new or different. We want to explore that more, because oftentimes, like we were saying, kids may not have the language to say exactly what's going on for them. And I think that kind of brings us well into the next slide. Just thinking about safety also includes safety planning in the home as well. Jenny, if you could just move us to the next slide.
I thought I did. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
There we go.
We also want to consider what appropriate supervision looks like for children, no matter where they are at their age and stage. It's pretty common for, kids to be in charge of one another, older siblings watching younger siblings, but it's also really important to take into account how comfortable the kids are with each other and what extra support might be needed in terms of supervision and check-ins to keep these short childcare activities safe. It can be necessary even for kids that we know well to still just treat them as kids who are learning and changing and who may make mistakes, and to really keep those extra safeguards in there. So Jane, I'm not sure, do you have any guidance about the role of supervision in sibling sexual abuse and prevention, and maybe how parents are supposed to supervise kids, or any tidbits of information that you think would be helpful in terms of safety planning in the home for parents?
Well, I'm going to start off by saying, no parent has the ability to have eyes on their children 100% of the time, and I'm not sure I want to do that. But I believe education is our first line of defense. education and prevention are first line of defense, and continue to educate your children. Start when they're 8. We've heard this. You've had these webinars. Start when they're 2 and 3. Read to them about body safety. Use the proper terms for body parts, and read to them about secrets. There's lots of online courses how to talk to your children, but don't stop there. Again, when they enter puberty, it's a huge opportunity. It's a huge opportunity for learning for them and for us as an adults, because like I've said, as they age, as they get older into puberty and adulthood, you need that open door policy. So keep educating your children, and don't consider it a one and done conversation, because I don't know, in my house, I have to keep reminding them, pick up your clothes, close the refrigerator door. How many times do I have to do that? It's the same thing with body safety. They have to keep being reminded. That's what I would offer. But again, it's different after the abuses happen. I have things about that, but.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it grows and changes as the kids do, and as they need more and new and different supports. And just kind of continuing on that path, we also want to acknowledge how often we hear these kinds of questions from parents, when should we X, Y, and Z change the supervision of, kids when it involves sleeping, bathing, nudity. I was just wondering, what do you think we should be thinking about in terms of siblings' age and them living together? Do you have any type of guidance, maybe even general guidance for parents or people who work with parents who are then asking these type of questions?
Again, education and when the child enters puberty. And the experts talk about if there's a huge age gap, but even that for me is a little slippery, because I've heard of children being sexually harmed or abused by a younger sibling or a child who's the same age. I think education and when they enter puberty that's when you need to be on high alert, and these activities need to be really monitored. Yeah,
thank you for that.
Yeah, I will throw one more thing in here, because the sibling sexual abuse it's tricky, and it can happen in small spurts. It can happen in the bathroom, it can happen in the closet, it can happen at bath time, it can happen when children are sleeping. So it can happen quickly.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. And I would add that we often let folks know on our helpline that when a child starts showing curiosity about other genders, about body parts, this may be a good time to start having them private bath time, or to start looking at your sleeping arrangements, or even family rules. It may be time to start adapting, changing with the door closed, and thinking about your family values and thinking about the structure and routine of your family. And taking that all into consideration, and not that like, oh my gosh, my 5-year-old asked about my 4-year-old's penis and we're all going to run into a tizzy about it. But that's a great time now to start talking about privacy, to start talking about safe rules, and to say it may be time now that you're old enough that you deserve privacy in the bathroom by yourself, so that we can kind of build that in to the changes that children are going through their developmental and cognitive growth that they're experiencing. So let's read another letter. We haven't heard from one of our helpline folks again, and kind of similar question. This parent wrote about that a few weeks ago. I learned my 13-year-old asked my 11-year-old if he wanted to play sex. They both took turns taking their penis out and pushing it into each other's butts. My 11-year-old told us after it happened, and after a lot of talking and crying, we learned that this had been going on since he was 7. And my older son was only 9 then. It sounds like the first time it happened, my 13-year-old forced him against his will. My 13-year-old admitted it right away and was distraught. We're struggling with treating our oldest son as a sex offender right now and feel truly torn. So, this is, again, a very typical letter, and we've definitely touched on so much of this. But, in the moment of discovery, when a parent is first finding out because a child has disclosed or they've walked in, it's hard because the parent's they're not going to be able to say, wait, hold on everything, I'm going to call the Stop It Now helpline. But, in general, what could we advise parents that should this situation face you, how would we want them to respond?
I'm going to actually defer to this parents on this and maybe some professionals, because I am not a parent who has experienced this. My bigger concern here is that this child has harmed a younger child, and we would need to explore whether this child who caused the harm has been harmed. Have they been sexually harmed, or have they been exposed to pornography? And sex offender, as we've talked about, that's a strong term for an 11-year-old. But I mean, because you do want them to call Stop It Now. And because as I said, I'm not a parent who's experienced this, and it is because it's the wild, wild west. My thing is that the whole family needs help. My hope would be that a family would report it, but there's so many unknowns. I can't look at you and say your child's not going to be taken to juvenile. I don't know that. And I know that it's hard to go through the system, and it's devastating, but if you slide it under the rug, it's so much worse and so much more traumatizing. But maybe there's a professional in the audience who would say, exactly, you discover this, what do you do?
Well, we can add a little bit to that. I mean, certainly we know that anytime we discover that anybody has been sexually harmed, our first response has got to be, I'm so glad you told me, and I believe you, and I'm here to support you. And so that doesn't change here. And in fact, it may be even more important, because that child may have a lot of fear about what does this mean for our whole family? I may have just disrupted the family. What's going to happen to my brother, my sister, my sibling, and my cousin? I'm going to be responsible for this. So I think the first response is a lot of reassurance and thank you. And it's the adult's job, your parent's job, to address what's going on and make sure that you get the help that you need, and to make sure that your brother or sister gets the help that they need. Often some reassurance that we love everybody can be really helpful, so that a child's not carrying, oh, I'm responsible for my siblings, loss of love in the world and loss of stability. And we don't want a child who has been harmed, to carry that, right? And so it is delicate. And I also think it's very hard for parents in this position to not have a lot of shock and the shock and awe. And how do you manage those emotions in the moment? And as much as I can encourage folks, we want to help folks feel as calm in that moment. It doesn't mean that later they shouldn't find a place to fall apart and say everything they need to say. That may be ongoing. They may need some professional support. So however that support is available and makes sense for them. But in the moment, we really hope that adults can take that deep breath and know that I need to portray myself as calm, strong, loving, and that we're going to be able to address this as a family, knowing that anything can happen. You're right. We don't know what could happen. We don't know, especially if, we're talking about children who are over 12, what could happen in the long run. But right now, the most important is everybody's safe, right? As we know, we're going to make sure everyone is safe right now moving forward.
Yeah, I would like to add to that, actually.
Yeah, great.
Not only thank you for telling me, but I believe you.
Yeah.
And there was something I wanted to add to that as well, but I did lose it, so I apologize.
Welcome to my brain. Well, we'll keep moving on then, but if you think of it, please, because we are definitely coming to the end, and there were just a few more important points that we wanted to share with folks. So, and I don't want to rush through the next steps, although we do tend to in these webinars talk more not about the next steps in terms of treatment and what has to happen after harm has caused. But, as I just said, the safety planning is so important, and that we will probably be looking at safety planning in relationships, in environments, and not just in the home, but kind of across the board. I know that I saw earlier, somebody had mentioned, and there's physical pain, and there's, there may be medical attention that's needed. So we want to address absolutely any child's needs around their well-being, their physical well-being. We talked already a little bit about reporting, and that may indeed be a part of this process. And I know that's really hard for parents to think about picking up the phone themselves to make that call. But I really want to share particularly with the professionals who may be working with parents, that parents initiating that call as they begin to put together a safety plan and pull in their professional supports are going to retain a lot more control over a situation. That I know we can't convince a parent that, oh, nobody's going to blame you, or this is necessarily what you have to do. But what we want them to understand is you can't reach out for help without most likely a professional making this report. So how can we help you start that process already? Reach out to Child Protection Services and let them know, we've discovered in my family that my 9-year-old has been sexually harming our 5-year-old. We've reached out to a therapist. We're addressing supervision. We're addressing environmental safety. Is there anything else that you would advise us to do? And sometimes that's a great way then, for parents to stay in control. But, at the end of this, I guess what we all hope is that we can reestablish family safety. And so, Jen, I'm wondering about that element. We don't have a lot of time, but there are a couple of real important pieces that we would want folks to take away with as they start thinking about how would this family ever come back together after something like this happens?
Well, that's a great question. I think going forward, the plan has to be proportionate to the risk, because sibling sexual abuse changes the whole dynamic of the family. And your life is changed. It's been described to me as there's the before and then there's the after. I believe, I've experienced a grief process, and I think it's a grief process. You're going to be grieving what was and going into what is now. And going as for safety plans, parents have to evaluate what is their ability to protect, who needs therapy. This is something that I would like to share going forward. Say you have 3 kids and you have one child who's harmed a child, and maybe they're removed from the home, and maybe the other remaining 2 siblings still share a room. It's really important that you talk to the sibling who has experienced the harm, or separate them so that they aren't sharing a room with another sibling, because I cannot tell you how many survivors have reached out to me and have said, I was harmed and then I did it to another child. So we don't want this cycle to continue. And then there's shame on top of shame, and it's heartbreaking. So that's something that I would ask for parents and professionals to take into consideration if there's another child in the home that maybe wasn't harmed.
Thank you. Really helpful. Appreciate that.
Sorry, I was just looking for my unmute button. Yeah, so as Jenny said right at the beginning, we also hear from, other people as well, including adults and parents of adult children who are asking questions like these. So this is a letter from a parent who just learned that their adult child experienced abuse by his brother. This parent says, my 24-year-old son just shared he was molested by his brother when he was young. His brother was 3 years older and passed in an auto accident. My son gets anxious, turns to alcohol, struggles with suicidal thoughts, even though he knows he doesn't want to hurt himself. This parent wants to know how he can help him. He has not had good experiences when seeking counseling, partly because he says he doesn't reveal his real self, and partly because he says he doesn't know how to articulate himself. And this is pretty common. We hear a lot about just how much pain people are in after they discover their child has sexually harmed their sibling. It can be all of these feelings and more. How could they have missed it? Wouldn't they have known something was going on? What does this say about me and my parenting skills? The shame, the guilt, the anger, the confusion, and of course the denial that, of course, if something this serious was going on, wouldn't I just have known? Wouldn't I have been aware? It's it's just not possible, right? So all these feelings and more could be what parents are feeling. And that kind of leads us into some of the common responses that we also hear from parents in this situation. They want to fix everything. They want to kind of step in just like they did when they were, their kids were children. They want to know all the details, which can be re-traumatizing. They want all the family gatherings to go back to normal like this never happened. And of course, they want to push resources, information therapy, because they think that's what would help, right? Yeah, so Jane, I don't know if you have just a final thought for, parents here who are just learning about their child's abuse. What can they do? Because we know that sometimes their well-meaning agenda can actually impede the healing process for their child.
Yes, first of all, you can't fix everything. People within the family are going to have to do the work. I think that the healing journey is very individual. I think it's like a fingerprint. Wanting to know all the details, I'm going to be blunt. It's really none of your business. Survivors, for myself, I've been able to write down the details, but I don't share the details. Every survivor is different, though. Wanting things to go back to normal, it's a grief process. And pushing resources and information on the therapy, again, it's an individual journey, and the survivor, the child who is harmed, will take those resources when they are ready. I actually have something written by a parent, and I think it's very beautiful. This is by a parent who discovered this later when the children were adults. If I may, it's quick. I'm going to read it really quickly. First, get yourself support because you will need it. This will be a marathon, not a sprint. You need to be able to take the long view. You'll have to grieve the family you thought you had and your own identity as a parent. Even if many of the details that your child may remember might not add up to circumstances or timelines you remember better as an adult, the gist of what happened should be believed, and the truth of how they feel about it and how it is affecting them is paramount right now. It's vital to let your survival child take the lead and take control of the situation, and to honor their choices on things like who they want to see at family gatherings, who was told about what happened, whether to report to the authorities, whether they go to therapy, etc. The survivor had control taken away when the abuse occurred, and they need to have the chance to regain control now as part of their healing. It may feel as if there's nothing you can do, but just your belief and support of the one who was harmed as a child is still fundamental. And your unconditional love and support of the child who caused the harm may also be a lifeline to that child. I wanted to share that from a parent who's actually gone through it.
Yeah,
Oh, thank you.
that was really beautiful.
Yeah. I believe we addressed all of this, Jane, and I wish we had so much more time to talk. And I knew that. And I can see so many different threads that I wish we could kind of unpack more. The helpline is here for folks. The links that Brandy, Maria, others of you have been sharing. So I don't know if you know this, Jane, you have had just like a wealth of expertise supporting you behind this with some great additional information and resources.
Great.
I do know, and this question is still on my mind about making it reporting and speaking out more accessible for folks who may not trust the system. And I hope we address that just a little bit with some guidance about working with child protection services. But we know for a lot of families, they aren't going to reach out for help from a system. We understand that. What we want to make sure all of you are able to find a support that meets your family's values, that addresses the risk and the harm that you may be addressing in your family. That the most important thing we want parents to know is that we can't not do something. So even if systems don't feel safe, there are other ways to talk with professionals or other support folks so that you're not alone and that you're able to keep your family safe, or to help your clients and the folks you're working with in the community address concerns in their family. So
Can I add one thing really quickly
please,
to that?
Micah.
Just a theme that I was hearing when Jane was answering questions, and something that I think is really important just when we're thinking about those kinds of next steps, is making sure that if you are thinking about addressing this and involving other professionals, of course, there are people out there who do fantastic work, but we also have to acknowledge that not every therapist is going to be the right therapist for you or your family. So finding that therapist, social worker, clinician, whomever it is, taking the time to find someone who is trauma informed, even if they don't have all the knowledge that they need on this topic, if you're finding someone who's willing to do the work, who's culturally competent, who feels like they have your and your children's best interests in mind, that is the person to go with. And it's worth spending the time and using the resources and networks that you have already in your life to find someone who you can build a rapport with, or your children can build a rapport with.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as usual, and we thought we'd have even more time for questions, and I do see more situations coming into the chat. I invite folks to feel free to email our helpline, to visit Jane's resources as well. We will be sending out the recording. I saw somebody ask about that, and plus all of our recordings are available on the Stop It Now training page. They're also, and they're put on YouTube, so they live in infamy up there for you all. We'll send out some handouts and some resources that we use to compile this webinar. And we're just so happy you all could join us. And mostly, Jane, thank you for your courage. Thank you for your honesty, for your wisdom, just being real with us. And I can tell lots of comments have come in. Thank you so much. People are really appreciative for this opportunity. So you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much. Stay safe. And we'll see you hopefully at our next webinar.
Thank you for this
everyone.
opportunity.